Hello, everyone. Gonna wait for folks to make sure they're all joining. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Scott, and I want to welcome all of you to this very special BRJA monthly event. Normally it's on the 13th, but we added an extra day for the 14th for our anniversary, and we're really excited to talk more about BRJA, our past, our present, and where we are going. So we wanted to let folks know that throughout our time together tonight, please know that you are expected to hopefully participate. We want you to use the chat. If you can put your cameras on, that will be really lovely. There will be various times throughout our event tonight where we'll ask some questions. We'll put those in the chat for you, and they'll also be on the slides. And we are hoping if you have specific questions, when it's time for question and answer, you can let myself or Michelle know. We'll be moderating and looking at the chat to answer any questions or to, make sure that the panel knows any specific questions. So I am going to turn it over to our next speaker, and then we can get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. The next slide is our official welcoming slide for this particular 14th of the month event, which is about 20 years of racial justice. Those of us who were there 20 years ago can hardly believe that it's been 20 years, but it has. The next slide is a kind of summary of our purpose for tonight. And we're thanking Anthony Newman for these words that he wrote in just a very informal email to some of us who were going to be working on this tonight. But it says it perfectly. BRJA would not be seeing a 20th birthday if it were not for all of our commitments to racial justice. And I know by all, Anthony means all of every person here and every person who's ever been part of BRJA or who has done the kind of racial justice work that needs doing. Tonight, we will reflect on the evolution of BRJA, the racial justice landscape 20 years ago, and the work required for the next 20 years. We're hoping to spend more of the time on that last part, but also at first honoring those beginning years and the evolution of how BRJA has changed over those years. We're going to show a slide, we're going to show a slide of the panel, and then pretty soon each of the panel members will introduce themselves. You can see that Ayadora Yura is one of the panelists who has been with us. All three of us have been there from the beginning when the group was first being founded. A beautiful slide of Maricela holding her heart. And I don't know where that picture in the middle came from, really. I don't really recognize that person, but I was also there in the beginning. So we can go on to the next slide and also spotlight the panel at this point. We want to really use a symbol of where we are after 20 years and looking forward to the next 20 years. And Maricela sent us this beautiful slide of a really strong tree that is spreading its branches out as it spread its roots out that we can't see. And so we can kind of think of the trunk as BRJA and the roots that we can't see as very specific people like Margot Okazawa-Ray, who really got the foundations of our model and our philosophy from. Stan Markowitz, who we got a lot of teaching skills from. And so many people, ancestors, writers, teachers, who come before us, and the roots are still growing as they do with trees. So there's still new roots growing underneath us all the time. And those branches are, as Adar said earlier, those are the things that show the impact of BRJA over the 20 years. So thank you, Maricela, for that image, which I think we can hold in our minds as we go on. The next slide is of our nearest ancestors who are no longer with us on this planet, but with us constantly in our thoughts and memories and spirit. Diana Day, Avis Ransom, Betty Robinson, all of whom made transition from this space in 2020, the last 6 months of 2020. Let's take a breath at that one. Okay, so now I'm just going to ask each of us panelists to introduce ourselves, starting with Adar, then Maricela, and then I'll wrap it up. And to consider 3 things. One is your reflection on the racial justice landscape 20 years ago. What was it like then when we first got started? What are the significant ways in which BRJA has evolved since 20 years ago? And how are each of us engaged in racial justice action in our lives today? So we're going to be brief with this, like approximately 4 minutes each, 4 or 5 minutes each, before we move on. So Adar?
Okay, so those are the 3 questions that we are answering now.
Yeah, and you can add something if you.
Yeah, no, I just want to be clear. I'm determined to follow instructions today during this. So as I reflect on the 20 years, what the landscape was like before, you know, people were not doing this work. Diversity had not cropped up as an industry the way that it is now. There was either a apathy about, you know, doing this, or an ignorance about doing it. What is it? Why are we bringing it in? Or an open hostility to it, particularly in institutions. And I remember when I moved to Baltimore, thank you so much, Dottie and Maricela, because I moved to Baltimore to be with my community. And you know, people were not, BRJA was the only, and even before BRJA, because Dottie and Maricela and Stan, agents of change, there would be no BRJA without the Agents of Change Collaborative, and the work that we were doing and that we were doing through Core Concepts and Paso Consulting, and just trying to continue to go through every door and to get doors to open. That is what I remember from 20 years ago. That what are the significant ways that BRJA has evolved? I think that the lifeblood of BRJA continues to be community. And that may look differently than it did in the past, where we got together like, you know, every week or every other week, we had robust email exchanges, whatever. But our commitment to each other, to our, you know, our own growth and the growth of people in our community, that remains the same. I think that that's very significant. In terms of BRJA, we've hired staff, which for so long, we just remained a community, and we did everything as volunteers and through our separate consulting work or other work that we were doing. So having this work housed in this container that is not only the community, but the structure and institutional structure of BRJA. Thank you, Anthony, who is our first staff member who has brought us to this point. So that is different. And then how we are, or how I am engaged. Is this a personal question about my life, racial justice in my life?
Yes.
You know, I can say proudly, I am an ARAO, anti-racism, anti-oppression practitioner. And everybody who knows me knows that that is the way that I live my life, how I present, live, challenge, learn, grow during facilitations is the same way that I do in my life. When I go to a movie, I'm talking the racial and other ism dynamics that I see. If I'm looking at a TV show, as those on staff who know me, I'm doing a retrospective on old TV shows and how we got the gender dynamics that we have, how those shows supported and reinforced gender, patriarchy, and race dynamics. So I'm always reporting back on something new. But this is something that we live because racism and white supremacy morph in direct proportion to the level of resistance it receives. And so what it looks like now may not be what it looked like 20 years ago. And so we have to continue to practice and to grow in our analysis and also continue to heal ourselves of the messages that we've been inculcated with on the way. Because if we can't do that for ourselves, we cannot do this work in community with everybody else. So that's it. And I'm passing it to you, Marcella.
You're muted.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Adar. So the first two answers that Adar offered are similar to mine. So 20 years ago, similar to what Adar mentioned, and I also think of BRJA even 10 years before that. If y'all remember that workshop in DC with Margot Okazawa Ray, right? That was like really congealed things, I think, like really, when I say congealed the work of BRJA, even then, before it became officially a structure that we now today know as BRJA, I feel BRJ was in formation in smaller pods the 10 years previous. And that's what I remember actually, quite frankly, as the beginning of BRJ was the trip to DC. That's when you lived in DC, Adar. And we were like, you just need to move down here, Baltimore, this is where it's happening. And you did. And being in community with people. And for me, I think what's been important has been the relationships that we build. Like we love each other, like we've been friends, you know, like we care about each other's health, we care about each other's families. So what has evolved over the years and since the beginning pre-framework BRJA has been a relationship of care, a network, a community of practice, community of support. And I really do think that that's what has allowed BRJ to be sustainable, is there is a community rooted in care and love and justice, absolutely, and healing, absolutely. And also it starts with us. And I think the way I see the evolution is really maintaining those relationships of care, the communities that at the end of the day, when we're exhausted and something another, you know, some person in the White House says something ignorant again, and we're hurt again, and we're like, what do you do? Having each other to be with is so important. It's so important. In the evolution of BRJ, what I see is more intersectionality, and I really appreciate that. Bringing in LGBTQIA, having the 13th expose, explore, enjoy, raise and hold up, all the way our communities of marginalization intersect with racial justice is so important, and how white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, disability, anti-immigrant, Christian, all that, and how white supremacy really lives and feeds off all the marginalized groups. It's kind of like it's fuel, right? And so I've really seen the evolution over the years of bringing, back in, 20, 30 years ago, we could barely just get racial justice in a sentence, right? So now, because we have that platform, it's allowed us, I think, to evolve more and to bring broader, just like the tree, like the branches can grow even more and really take good care of the family. How am I involved in racial justice now? I'm involved with a nonprofit called Volar, Village of Love and Resistance. We're a Black-led organization in East Baltimore, Old Town, that's looking at land reclamation. And when we say reclamation, it's reclamation from white superiority and power, and exploitative development and healing and building grassroots community power. And so that's some of my racial justice work. My racial justice work also shows up in the mindfulness communities that I'm involved in around healing and healing justice work. Really present there, bringing into those spiritual spaces racial justice as well, right? Because we don't leave it at the door when we go and meditate. We take it in with us, and so we need to take care of racial justice and the intersections there as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wait, Marcella, before you stop, can you also talk about the Wellness Collective?
Yeah, so the Wellness Collective is a collective where several of us are taking care. It's this wellness journey together. So it's this understanding that this wellness is part of justice. With the collective justice can really only be sustained if we really take care of our individual health. And how do we do that in community? Again, this understanding of communities of care, communities of practice. And so our wellness circle is just that, is people who are interested in really highlighting that as a big part of the work. And it's not that it's about talking about racial justice then, but it's talking about what do we need for our own transformation of our trauma. The body holds everything. The body has been holding everything. Our ancestors laid it on our feet and we took it up. And so how do we transform that as we do this work of justice, so that we don't come out of anger when we do the work, but we come out of compassion and understanding for the work of justice. And it requires work on ourselves, honestly, in order to do that collective work. If not, we can really get it twisted. Yeah. Thanks, Adar.
Thank you both, and you both covered so much of the territory. I'm going to be very brief. What I would add to the climate, the environment, when we first started the organization 20 years ago, was the goal of the workshops that we were holding. And this was, again, as Adar was referencing, Agents of Change was mostly probably in there. Part of our goal with white people who were participating was to persuade them that, yes, racism does exist. I mean, when I think back how we had to spend time on that basic question, which for people who self-select to be in workshops, which was the case then, we don't see that anymore. people self-select, they are doing it because they already know that basic fact. Racism exists. So there's something in that that speaks to the evolution, not just of BRJA, but of the whole issue of racial justice over this period of time. In terms of how has BRJA evolved during the 20 years, Dana, could you show the next slide? Because I'm going to use Diane's work to talk about this part. So many of the resources that we have are because Diane's either took care of them or designed them. And this was one that she did probably just shortly before or shortly after Anthony was hired as the first full-time employee of BRJA. And it starts with that building in New Orleans where there was a conference specifically targeted for white anti-racist activists, and activism being very broadly defined. Brenda Zook-Friesen and I attended that. We actually met in New Orleans, even though we're both living in Baltimore. And I really tried to find Brenda to be with us here tonight, but I could not locate anything to be in touch with her. But the second picture is the gathering of people that she and I identified as being engaged in anti-racism work. And we spent years actually just building community with that group before we even thought about being an organization and having a name and all of that, which I still believe is one of the reasons that the kind of community that Adar and Maricela have already talked about has been able to keep growing and keep discovering that some of the hardest moments are the moments where we learn the most and build the community to a deeper level. The little kitty cat is the actual formation of what was called BARN at the time, Baltimore Anti-Racism Network. And the next slide, as being the white person on this panel, is my favorite, I think, because it really was a huge turning point. The cartoon says, if you can't see it very well, new white members join who are still learning. And we had to face the reality that doing anti-racism workshops with both white people and people of color in the same space was putting all the load, the pain on the people of color in the room and depriving them of much opportunity to do the kind of growing, processing, and bonding with one another that was really important. So that's when we first formed WARN. We started the White Affinity Group first to get us folks out of the way so we could say the things that were really not appropriate in a mixed race setting, and to sort of prepare people to be more prepared to be in a mixed race setting. It was a while later before BACO formed. And I think of that not only as an organizational change, but as a shift, because the beginnings of BRJA were in that conference for white people, and it was about white people stepping up and taking some risks instead of just leaving the whole burden on people of color to change things. And I think there was a beginning of a shift that has really transformed in a way the core structure and philosophy of BRJA to anti-Blackness. So that piece was I think what has brought us into the present in a very different way from where we were in the very beginning. And the kitty cat restructured again with all those different colors. The last thing with the umbrella was Diane's brilliant way of putting this rather odd structure that had developed over the course of the years into the umbrella of BRJA. So we now want to give people who are here and have been listening a chance to think about your own thoughts about these things, to ask us questions. The reflection for you, which I think was already put up in the, was it in the chat? Was, what was your first awareness of BRJA and what caught your interest about the organization? So that's your reflection question. You can put your answers in the chat. You can raise your hand to speak. You can also ask the panel any questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom thing. So we'll just take a moment for you to reflect, think of what you want to ask.
Dottie, while people are taking that moment, if I can go back to something, Marcella, you reminded me of this. I remember that the first big point of dissension where we actually lost members of the community was when the question was on the table, do we only talk about race or do we talk about other ism issues? And there were people in the room who only wanted to talk about race. They did not want to include other isms in the conversation. And it got so heated that, I mean, people actually left the community because the rest of us said, nope, we are going to acknowledge the centrality of race. But we're also going to acknowledge that there are other isms, and they are devastated. They're devastating communities too. And I think that through the years, a way in which we've evolved is that we have gotten sharper and clearer about the centrality of race role, while still keeping in mind and keeping focus on, as Marcella said, the intersectionalities of oppression and how those work.
I was just gonna say really quickly, oh, we have some hands raised, awesome. Betsy?
Hi, my name is Betsy, and I moved to Baltimore when I was 24. I first heard about BRJA in 2005 when they were teaching the first class called Confronting Racism. And I had been talking to some friends who were activists about how I wanted to be more aware of and more conscious about race, and I didn't really have opportunities to talk about it. And one thing that stands out for me, that it seems like such a low bar, but just that it was a place to talk about race. Actually, that actually was, I mean, there were many wonderful things that I learned in that and have grown from being part of BRJA, but just when I think about initially, even just having a space that we could intentionally have that time was something that I actually didn't have in other places in my life.
Thanks so much for sharing, Betsy. We also have some stuff in the chat here. We have from Sarah that they were introduced to BRJA through a DAR. They were learning about different frames, ARAO being BRJA's frame. And I was going to actually write that I also was introduced to BRJA through a DAR because she came to speak at my job. And I was like, who was that lady? And yeah, now here I am. So that's really cool. And we have some other folks, Rebecca sharing that she had attended Tammy had attended a 13th of the month event and took the public workshop for white people. And her experience was so positive. I wanted to take the workshop too. I think this is probably Michelle. The first awareness was from Diane Kuthi, telling them about BRJA and recommending that I take the class and find people that they could bond and learn from. So thank you. I see more people adding their stories, and we love to hear these during our events.
I'm going to add that one of our earliest, at probably the same time as Betsy, maybe, attendees was Olivia Fight, who now lives in Portugal. And she did her best to try to stay up late enough, but emailed me that she wasn't going to make it. So she had some lovely things to say about what BRJ meant in her life. I know that we have at least one of another person who was in that original group that spent years building community before we named BRJA, and that's Cynthia Taylor. I don't know, Cynthia, if you would like to say anything.
I'm trying to manage my buttons here.
Thank you.
Just want to say how good it is to see Adar and Marcella. I have seen Dottie, and Dottie, you look beautiful. One of the early things, Adar, when we talked about at the beginning, was we had an African American man who said several things that were very offensive, and in trying to be inclusive of him, we were not going to allow him to denigrate members of the group. And it felt uncomfortable getting him to leave, but it was the right thing to do. And there was something else. My claim to fame with the group is that I invited Diane. So, and in the early days, my first workshop was actually with Adar and Dottie through the United Methodist Church, and then I took, I guess it was Agents of Change at the Little House, and one of the things that I do remember that was very important during the time when we were doing some of the work in the community was, and I may be wrong, Marcella, but I recall, I thought it was you and Avis who did the debriefing session with the facilitators. And that was very important because the work they were doing at the time, there was just nowhere to have an outlet. And so I remember us being able to come together and work through those issues. The other thing I remember and it might be a memory that's not correct, but I remember Adar being very insistent on the fact that there couldn't be a group until we had relationships and trust. And it was like, no, we can't go anywhere. We can't do anything without that. One of my most unusual experiences with the group was when we traveled to Pennsylvania or somewhere, and I think it was Quakers, and it was actually a white event for white anti-racism workers. I can't remember why I ended up going, but I think they had invited a few people of color, and during that day, Dottie, do you remember? I don't know if you remember that, but we stopped and we went outside because there were Quakers and they were doing an anti-war protest on the front lawn that they did every day. And that was just one of the unique experiences I had. And I'll just end by saying, I used to introduce myself as the cheap alternative, inexpensive alternative to Dottie and Adar. And because I wanted people to know that the work they did was very valuable, but sometimes groups just couldn't afford it. And I would get to work with them. And I wanted to honor the fact that you never ask for a lot of money by consultant standards, but some of the groups that wanted assistance, they didn't have much money. And I think the last time I worked with Marcella was when we were in East Baltimore, and I just appreciated so much that we did some offshoot work, and Stan and I did some work with the board on hiring the executive director, and how important that work was to me because I had to go on to hire and fire executive directors in future organizations that I led. I think that the work is very difficult, and I applaud you all. I went a different direction, but I can't tell you the number of times I've mentioned to people the importance of the separation, that white people need to be separated. And I always just say, well, this group I was in, and this is why. And there's still so much resistance to that. But I'm finding one of the groups that I work with is, I can't remember, but it's called the Supper or something. And they do meetings, and they do meetings together, and then they separate you into your groups, and then you come back together. And I think people really valued that. But I value all three of you, Marcella and Adar. I miss the movies. Love you
Well,
all.
and love you back, and what you're sharing about the importance of community. Again, we can't emphasize that enough. Everybody who was among the founding members of BRJA, most of them had gone through agents of change. That is how we knew each other, right? Every movement, every organization doing this type of work builds on things that have come before, the people who've come before, who put in the work. BRJA built upon agents of change. Agents of Change was inspired by those who came before us. This work is intergenerational, and just going back to that beautiful picture of the tree with the branches. BRJA seeds. We seed relationships, we grow relationships, we bloom relationships. We seed our own healing. We seed healing each other in community. We grow that. We help each other come into the fullness of their own bloom. And as we do that for ourselves and for each other, we're also doing that for the communities that we're trying to create, for the institutions that we're trying to create, that those community members have to go to and work in. This is about healing our society and about creating justice. And everybody, all of you here in community with us this evening, and all of those that you touch are part of that. And that is the importance of relationship building with a frame of an analysis that people can put all of this complex stuff into, so that we can concentrate on our healing ourselves and our healing each other, and our coming into the fruition of justice that this country has never seen. It is up to us. And hopefully this will be work that that we provide as legacy to those generations moving forward, just like we have had generations providing that as legacy for those of us who are interested in taking up this work.
Anthony, you just asked a question in the chat. So I'm going to ask you to first answer the question, not because you were one of the co-founders, but because you were the first full-time or any staff position in BRJA. And that was a huge turning point for the organization that has enabled unimaginable, wonderful things for the organization and for the people we've worked with. So Anthony?
Way to turn it around, Dottie. So I'm answering the question that I asked. Is that what's happening?
No, we'll first answer the question of when did you first become aware of BRJA and why were you interested?
So it's so great that Maria is here. So I was doing work with my full-time job, and Neighborhood Voices was about, I think, a year or two in. And so I had inherited a project where we were having conversations about racism in Southeast Baltimore, and Avis and Diane were brought in to facilitate the history, the vocabulary piece of this. And I was able to convince my job, hey, I need to get trained so we can do this in-house, all with an ulterior motive to actually jump ship and join BRJA so I could stop cheating on my full-time job and just be at BRJA full-time. So yeah.
So now you can ask your question to the whole group.
My question is that, yeah, BRJA is 20 years old. How, we've seen so many groups grow very fast and split very quickly because of conflict, or groups that just, even if they don't grow fast, just like conflict arises and they're just not able to weather it or able to heal, and the group splits. So how has BRJA been able to do that? And you all talking about the early years of there being some conflict and you all kind of deciding, hey, this is not the right group for some people. Most groups would have been like, well, that is the end. How have you all been able to say, in the early years, be able to say, okay, this, we're going to continue, and this is what the healing is for us to continue? And what would you say are still parts of that recipe today that's important in the healing, because conflict still arises kind of like internally within BRJA? And what would you say is part of that recipe?
Okay, I'm so dying to jump into this question. Marcella and Dottie, can I go first? So, and because this is my pet peeve, right? There is a real difference between saying that you are practicing something and actually practicing it. And I think that that's one thing, one superpower, right? That the people involved in BRJA have, that we don't just say that this is what we do. This is what we do. This is what we do in our work life. This is what we do in our private life. This is what we do. We are anti-racism, anti-oppression practitioners. Our practice can take a variety of different ways, but we practice actively every day, which means that there is a level of self-reflection that we have to do every day. How did we show up? Did we live our principles? Did we live our practices that day? If we didn't, who do we have to make repair to? How do we forgive ourselves, right? How do we let go? And as Marcella said, all of this is very difficult work. It's not something that you put on when you step into your job at 8:45 and then take off when you leave your job at 7. You are either practicing or you are not. You cannot get halfway in. You're all in, or you're really not in at all, because you aren't living what you say you practice. And so that's my answer. Okay, Dottie, Marcella, yours.
I just want to name one person who I think gave us a resource that has been invaluable in keeping the core community of staff and board together, which is Liz Lerman, who allowed us to be, she trained us, and then in a method of evaluation and performance evaluation, I'll just say, and then allowed us to adapt her model to just slightly enough for it to be more useful for our particular purpose. And I will never forget, we're always mentioning Diane because she's always here. I will never forget, she was maybe the, I don't know, 4th or 5th person to be the subject of that process. And she was just so negative. I mean, she did not want to do it. I hate evaluations. I've never had an evaluation I just hate. And she came out of it just praising the whole thing. I've never had an evaluation like this. And I really think, especially for the staff who every day are in this, and it's not always easy in the moment, on the day-to-day and all the pressures of it, to really work through what's really going on for a particular member of that group. So I think that's been a really major part, especially, like I said, for the people who are doing the work every day or on a very regular board basis.
Dottie, what do you think I'm sorry, Marcella, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
That was very recent, more recent BRJA history. What about those earlier years when we didn't have Liz Lohman? What do you think kept people together during that time?
Well, you've already covered that.
Okay, got it. So, okay, my bad. Marcella?
Yeah, I think in addition, I think that so this might sound a bit controversial, but I think BRJ attracts good people. What I mean by that as good people, I mean people who have big hearts and who are very interested in their individual transformation, not just this externalizing of racial equity, meaning there's people who are interested in racial justice but have no self-reflection. And so it's an externalized thing. And so their own trauma from racism and their own, because white people have trauma from racism too, right? I mean, you know, white supremacy has done a number on white people's hearts. In order to carry out white supremacy, it has taken some serious segregation of the heart space to have ignored this history. So we all have trauma from white supremacy and racism and the way it's played out. So what I find with BRJA is that the people at the core and who continued to bring and gather people into that core, people who have internal reflection. And for me, what an internal compass is a sense of a spirituality, a deep sense that there's something good here, there's kindness here, there's a humanity that wants to evolve into something the most beautiful that it can be. And I'm part of that. So how am I also evolving into the best self that I want to be, which means healing from this effect of racism, right? That kind of internal landscape and measuring stick, it's an integrity that keeps us, I think, really connected with each other. And something that allows us to stay together is knowing that people we're around are committed in the same way that we are committed. If you know that, then you trust that. Even when all the things are going and things are fraying and externally there's like, you know, chasms or whatever, this sense of like, okay, but we're in this together. We're coming from it from the same space of internally healing and also being able to externalize that healing in a collective way, this collective recovery process. I really do think that that's a part of what keeps any organization together, and the history in BRJA, seeing that experientially, that the people involved with BRJA from the very beginning were good people, you know, good, solid, big-hearted people that loved deeply and that wanted to figure out how to love even more deeply. And that's where our healing has really come in, I think. And I think that's what keeps us together, even when there's difficulty. We'll find a way. Oh, there's an evaluation tool, right? There'll be a way. Oh, we'll do this analysis, this investigation, and this is how it serves this. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I did come up with one thing that I'll add, and then I know there were people who had their hands up. Would like to move to that second question about where we're going from here very soon. Now, the one thing I want to add to what's been said about answering Anthony's question, I think the fact that BRJA has been intergenerational from the very beginning and has nurtured that aspect of the organization has been really, really key. Julia and Michelle, were there people who you knew wanted to say something in answer to this?
So originally Elizabeth had their hands up. However, they put in the chat about, I think that's answering that first question. I was in the Confronting Racism and White Privilege, Building Power for Transformation and Change workshop in 2008, held at Sojourner Douglas College. It was the workshop during which the participants of color decided that future workshops should be separate. And while some whites were disappointed, all agreed that was an understandable and wise decision. So it's really great to hear from folks who were also like in those spaces, and seeing where they are now and how they got started.
We should share with the group as a whole, the first time we split the groups up that way, we were meeting on the same night. One room had the white group, the other room had people of color. So we had signs on the doors, white people and people of color. That really got some talk and protests going because it reminded people of terrible things about racism, and we'd had a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah,
So-
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I don't know if y'all remember that time, but that was some stressful, anxiety-ridden time, wasn't it? I mean, it just brought up like even my body, I can feel it, how stressed we were. And it felt like the Black folk, the folk of color, it was like almost like we were having to convince people, white people, that this was needed, this was necessary for us to be able to stay in the game. Like we couldn't keep going into these workshops and have you people as white, when I say you people, like in that context then where, as Dottie said, white people were like, oh, racism exists, like badger the folks of color facilitators would question. It was so hard for our hearts, right? We'd have these like processing meetings afterward. We'd be exhausted because we would be getting beat up over and over again in these workshops. And I remember particularly the United Methodist group that Cynthia spoke about, but I'm not going to call them in like I just did. Besides that, but because it connects to some of the next question around the future, which is what Cynthia just mentioned about separating the groups, right? Like we still meet some of those resistance in Buddhist space, where when we talk about we have to have the BIPOC group and then we have to have the white group do their work first so we can come together and not hurt each other. Because when we come together without some skills and some discussion, we actually hurt each other more, right? And so we're still now 21st century, still in some spiritual spaces having these same discussions because, you know, especially in the spiritual spaces, it's like we're all one, you know, we've like transcended the separation and all this stuff, right? You know, and that's not true, right? That's why I said we don't leave this stuff at the door when we go into these spiritual sanctuaries. And I do think that's, as much as it was a huge heartbreak back then, 20 years ago, it's still showing up to get today in a different way, I feel, maybe in some similar ways. Yeah, thanks.
I am so glad that you said that, because I was thinking to myself, okay, I don't remember it that way at all. It was not that mild of, okay, now we understand. It was a fight, and it was a piling on. And the thing that it brought up, which was true 20 years ago and is just as true 20 years later. What it brought up was how many white people get into this work to prove their own individual goodness as white people. And they want to, you know, what is important is not doing the self-reflection work that Dottie and Marcella were talking about. It becomes using these forums to prove that they're good white people, not like the other white people. And in doing the split of the racialized split of the group, it really brought that to the fore. Why are you really here? Because you don't need to hear from from people of color to confront the ways in which you are inculcated with whiteness practice. You can do that work on your own, and that is legitimate work to do on your own. You do not have to do that work on the back of people of color. And that speaking to that, and that white people having to look at themselves and answer, why am I really here? Am I really here because I want to do this work on the back of Black people? brown people, Asian Americans, or am I here to really look at how whiteness practices have a hold of me? That was what the resistance was about. And the people, I believe that it was a shock maybe for some of the white people who were there, who had not quite looked at it or seen themselves in that mirror, to the detriment of the people of color who were there, who had to deal with the backlash of that white reaction. And I see Betsy's hand. Hey, Betsy.
Hey, Adar. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I think that's, I completely agree with what you said. And I think that another way that I think of it or would phrase it is just that, like, when you're dividing up those groups, you are essentially forcing white folks to, rather than focus on their individual identity, acknowledge they have a collective, that we have a collective identity as white folks. That is a thing that exists, is a collective white identity. And even just the act of separating those groups is saying that there is a truth to this collective white identity. And that alone is enough for a lot of white folks to get really uncomfortable and get really scared and get, and most spaces don't ask white folks to do that. So yeah, really appreciated how you said that. And I would love to also just say that, Dottie, I appreciated what you said about the intergenerational component of BRJA. And I will just say, as the 25-year-old Betsy was so and is still so grateful for the mentorship that I got there, and that it was a space where I could learn and grow, and that it was for me, the strength of those relationships, even now years later, still just stands out to me, how strong the relationships were among those people who were founding. And it meant that then when you brought in newer folks, you had that basis and that grounding, and like really a space to help other folks grow and learn and change. So we'll always carry so much gratitude in my heart and so much love for BRJA. And yeah, so grateful also for tonight, for this chance to be reflecting on all this.
Thanks, Betsy. Shall we go to the next topic? Next slide. Okay, this is a biggie. We kind of have a sense of where we are right now based on where we've come from. But what is the world asking BRJA for in the next 20 years? I'm really looking forward to hearing people's thoughts. So each of the panelists will say whatever you want to say as a starting place. And I'm saying a starting place because what I'm hoping we can do with this piece is have a conversation among the three of us, rather than three separate presentations. So
Marcella, Dottie, what are your
I'll
thoughts?
start with saying I agree with Betsy on her comment, or their comment just now in the chat. Yeah. I think I'd like to suggest that so a lot of my more specific work around anti-racism is besides the work in Volar, which is organizing, as I said, around housing and anti-gentrification work. The other work is the work in the mindfulness community, and offering retreats for BIPOC folk. And so what I've been learning more over the years is just the healing that's required in our communities of color. And as I say, in white communities as well, but I'm not doing that. So I've kind of, in the mindfulness community, I'm doing the same thing I was doing when I was involved in BRJA, is it's workshops and retreats with BIPOC community. And because it's a different kind of space than, say, an anti-racism, anti-oppression workshop space, there's more revealing and vulnerability around the trauma and the pain that's there, that needs to be taken care of. And so I've been really reflecting, and this came up in a conversation actually a few years ago with Avis and Dottie and I don't know if you remember this, Dottie, discussing like, how do we take care of the healing part, directly or indirectly? And so for me, that's where I see the next edge, or the growing edge of BRJA is looking at that part. I don't know what it looks like. You know, it's not like I'm saying this is how you do it. I just, because of the places I'm in these retreat settings, and seeing how much healing is necessary there, and that healing is going to help folks be able to externalize the way that we then move our collective along. It just feels like, how do we bring that in? Or is it maybe it's not possible, I don't know, but that's a conversation that I'd like to be included in here. Thanks.
Mhm. And for me, I think that the way in which we have expanded our work with institutions is so really important, because institutions are the places where we spend the bulk of our time. We don't spend the bulk of our time with our families, the number of hours in a day, right? Actively, we're all trying to make a living. And that takes us into institutions that are oftentimes hostile spaces. So we are getting bombarded there with microaggressions, micro-invalidations, all of those things which need to be healed. We're also being still denied opportunity and access. So all of these things are building up. And the work that BRJA does with institutions, which are economic drivers, which have a place in maintaining or disrupting community health, because the individuals work there. And if those are hostile spaces, we bring those things home. And our work provides an opportunity for institutions to learn how to be different, to learn how to incorporate justice practices in how they do the work. Without a BRJA bringing an analysis, bringing shared language, shared concepts within institutions, I don't know how we continue to create change, which will impact families, communities, and individuals. So that work to me is very important. The other important piece of that are institutions are not only economic drivers, they can be justice drivers, because institutions have outsized influence in society. So if we are seeding justice, we're seeding justice with individuals, and we're seeding justice within institutions, so that we can create an environment in which justice will thrive as a society. And one of the things that BRJA says about our work is that it is to facilitate catalytic, transformative change individually, institutionally, and societally toward racial justice and justice related to other isms. That is a huge charge. But if we don't go into those spaces and pick up that mantle and help plant seeds within those institutions, so that the individuals there can take those seeds and grow them within the institution, and then take them out of the institution in their homes and in their communities. See, that's a big reach. And that's the reach that we have an opportunity to have. And last thing I'll say, and then I pass it to Dottie, is that the other work that we do is in partnership and collaboration. There is not another social justice movement especially in Baltimore, that someone in BRJA is not involved in, that someone who's not come through a BRJ workshop is not involved in, right? We were there when no other institution was, and our reach within this 20 years and the way in which we've seen that grow, even outside of BRJA, is what I see that, I don't know about the world, but at least Baltimore, that is what is still needed. And we see with people like Betsy, who is in Chicago doing aspects of the work, people like our colleague and dear friend Sina, who is in California doing this type of work. Right? We see Jackie, who doesn't think that she's doing the work, but God knows she's hung around us long enough to be doing the work. We see a reach, and I think that if we are cognizant of the reach, for us, it's just the work that we do. So we don't even think about it in that way. But I think that for our 20 years, that we can sit back and think, yeah, we've really got legs. You know, when I look at Anthony, when I look at Cynthia, who's doing the work in her way, you know, when I look at Rajani or Michelle or Rebecca or Julia or Mohammad, anybody, everybody, Tammy, the reach is incredible. So the seeds planted continue to grow and to bloom. And that is exactly what the world needs, continues to need from BRJA. Dottie, your thoughts?
Well, following through with your theme, Adar, of how important and absolutely necessary the institutional work is, because we're kind of stuck with all the institutions that have grown up, you know, just reinforcing white supremacy all over the place. And they're not going to disappear. I don't think so anyway. So what comes to me as you were speaking of that is, it's obviously an incredible opportunity that I don't know that there's anyone else around the Baltimore area anyway who's prepared to take that opportunity and do something with it. It's long term. So 20 years, you know, in the context of that future is just a drop in the bucket. And so it speaks to a topic we've been talking about a lot in the advisory board about how does the organization sustain itself, bring in the new leadership, do the kind of mentoring, and hearing the newer voices that haven't been in it for 20 years already, that all of that is so critical to fulfilling that opportunity that you described so thoroughly. And the flexibility to do that in the context of a larger world we're living in, which could, in a day, change a lot of things. So having the skills and the courage to carry what BRJ can carry within those institutions. And the topic that keeps coming into my mind for people within those institutions, there always seems to be that little core of people, both people of color especially, but sometimes white people who've been thinking about this for a long time and really want a space to do something effective. I keep thinking about risk and how that's something we've always talked about. I feel like in the coming years, preparing people to take risks, to build that kind of healing and spiritual base that Maricela was talking about, both as a group and individually, it's going to be so necessary, so absolutely necessary. I think we would all agree we're not headed for easy times, not even in Baltimore, where we don't see a lot of the things that other people see in other states. But it's going to have its impact. And this is such a core of strength and love within this organization that can enter into that risky world. How much time do we have left? We're 8:15.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
So we do want to welcome any questions from the participants who are here tonight. We didn't really have the free-flowing conversation I talked about. So do we want to say any additional things from what we heard from each other? Or do you want to open it up to the participants?
I would love to open it up.
Maricela? Okay. So what reactions, questions, comments, ideas, suggestions do you all have about the future that we're heading into?
Just a reminder, folks, you can either put your questions and comments in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, or if you want to raise your hand so we can call on you.
Can we ask questions of everybody? Can we throw questions out?
Sure.
Okay, so my question is, one of our questions was, how do we live these practices? So my question of everybody is, how do you all live ARAO practices? And that, or where do you find it easiest to practice, and where do you find it most difficult to practice? And that gets back to what Dottie was talking about in terms of risk.
I can share an answer, even though I'm like moderating. So I think that the hardest place is probably just in work. I mean, I've been blessed enough that, for one, I'm obviously a part of BRJA, so I have a space where I can be pushed and push back and kind of, really grapple with a lot of these topics. But work, even in my role as a DEI coordinator, it is how much risk, am I gonna, how much am I gonna put my neck out? Like, those are questions that I still think about. And I think, living with it, it's interesting, you all were talking about in the beginning how, like, oh, are we going to focus just on racism or various isms? And so I think that right now, I've been in the exploring how all of these things are connected, right? And so what does that mean for my relationships to systems and institutions that ideologically I'm against, that I'm saying one thing? So I think the harder part is also, living with the institutions, living with the systems, being complicit, or what does it mean to really be complicit, is the hard work for me, like in my personal life. And so that is, but also I think a part of the learning that, that's the struggle. And how am I going to actually play this? Am I going to actually live by what I say I am? That's the hardest part.
I've always said to people in institutions we've worked with that being a trainer, teacher, consultant in this work can be really, really hard. But being in that institution where people say they want change. I mean, that's the really hard work. And those questions about being complicit, what does that look like? Is that different from understanding where a group is and how to get them to the next level without ending the whole conversation? All of those questions get really hard. BRJA has the luxury of knowing that wherever we go with each other, we're in the same path. We may not be all at the same level, but we're on the same path. And that's not, I haven't seen an institution yet where that's true.
Mhm, mhm. And and I want to just acknowledge Julia, what you're saying too about risk, because the level of risk that in particular with being in an anti-Black society that a Black person has in doing this work, right? Where people will go after you if they have any ire at all about the process, because you're the easy person to go after. So living with that knowledge and living with that reality and living with that venom that comes after you all the time, it takes me back to what Marcella is saying about the ways in which we need to pay attention to our healing, and then to what Dottie is saying in the importance of having a community that will wrap arms around you when those things happen and you most need it. Other thoughts?
I want to throw out the question that I threw out 5 years ago at our 15th anniversary. And that was at the time, some people were still shell-shocked that Donald Trump was our president, right? And so we talked about these pieces in history in which people were shaken up, whether it be elections, whether that be, a George Floyd moment where Black people were murdered violently over the summer. Like, there's been these periods of time in which people, I hate the term, but decided to become woke. And so what do you all, I wouldn't want to say advice, but what is it that you all have grounded yourself in these past 20 years that you all have we've seen this pattern before? But what else is kind of like behind that for folks who have like a knee-jerk reaction that, oh my gosh, this is different, or this is the end, or the sky is falling? What is it that grounds you in these moments where it does seem like sometimes it's more intense than other times?
What grounds me is it's more than, this is familiar, but it is. But it's knowing that as a white person, I am not going to come up with the right answers. Not by myself, not just with a group of other white people, because we're in territory where if we don't step back from that concept, that if it doesn't feel right to me, then I can't go along with it. And I'm going to give an example of something from my husband Stan's life that taught me so much about that. I mean, Stan is a person, those of you who know him, of incredible integrity. He examines deeply any decision he's having to make, especially when it's around race or any of the other isms. And when he was at Essex Community College, he was highly respected. People would follow his lead on a lot of decisions. There was a hiring process where he really felt like the person who should get that job happened to be a white person. And the Black woman who was the affirmative action officer at the time argued with him. They argued with each other, and she didn't change his mind, but he stepped back. He knew that no matter how strongly he felt about it, this was not the time or place to trust his own judgment over hers. And that's what I think for so many of us who are white, we have to learn to do that. It's not saying it's always going to turn out that way, exactly, but learning to do it when you know, I just don't get it, but I'm trusting the relationship I have with this person. I think that particular kind of action doesn't happen very often.
Marcella, what are your thoughts?
I think it's community. It's resting in community wisdom. When things come up, whether it feels like this is new or whether it feels like more of the same. I think going back to those we trust and love, those we have been in the fire with, and listening to them, and not being ego driven with it, being able to really listen to what others are sharing. The benefit of the collective decision, I think, is always something I like to listen to before my own. And it doesn't mean that I don't take myself and my own experience as something that's important to be heard. I also insert it and into the collective to hear, like, how is it lining up or not lining up, and that gives me space to investigate more. So I'd say really it's community wisdom, and that wisdom comes from what we've been talking about this whole evening. I think is trust and relationship building and respect, and what I shared earlier is trusting that the people involved in this work, in BRJ's work, are good people with integrity, and come out of that from that space. So then I can trust in that community care.
And I trust history and practice. So, I'm going to trust what 400 years of history has shown. We have been at these inflection points before. What is happening now is nothing new. And history teaches us the pathways that we can go down, right? There have been white resentment resurrections at different points in history that have sought to overturn governments. That's not new. January 6th was not the first time that has happened. What we see in terms of how people are or are not being punished, there is a blueprint in US history for that too. There have been 3 other resurrections in different states. So this isn't new. This white resentment uprising is not new. This point where we have, someone who might be elected president with everything that we know about this person, that's happened before in US history. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because of the people allowing it to happen. And that is racialized too. And so, I would just say, and this is probably the greatest lesson that I learned from Stan Markowitz, which is if you know your history, then you know what you need to know. So knowing history and also seeing how people practice what they preach Because we can say, trust people, and yeah, trust, but definitely verify. Identity doesn't, and your individual experiences, that doesn't mean that you have answers. It means that we all speak from our experiences and our identity. We all speak from the ways in which we have been inculcated in white supremacy. So when we look at people, where are they in their healing journey? Do they have an analysis, or do they just universalize their personal experiences? What have we observed in terms of their practices, which is why community is so important, because it gives us an opportunity to really get to know the people and to know their practices. And that is how trust is or is not built. So it's not that you're going to look at a random Black person or a random Asian American person or a random Native American person and go, okay, they're Asian American, they're Black. They must know what they're talking about. No, they know, and they are experts in their own experience. But that does not mean that they have an anti-racism, anti-oppression analysis. It does not mean that they have attended to their own healing. It does not mean that they have an understanding of how American white supremacy morphs, evolves, and manifests in society. So our really incorporating all of those things, right? Because everything Dottie said, Marcella said, I said, this all goes into the gumbo. And it all seasons the gumbo. So bottom line, don't be eating any unseasoned gumbo, because you will not get what you think you want, and you will not get where you think you're going. Take all of this as a whole and not just parts of the message. So
what a great image to end with. It's 8:31 already. Of not making sure you know what's in the gumbo.
Make sure you know what's in the gumbo. Dottie, before we end, can I just throw one thing in the gumbo? And that, again, is what I'm most proud of about BRJA's 20 years. And that is the people. And not only the people who were there 20 years ago, but everybody who joined along the way. Because all of you have stakes in this. This does not belong to Dottie or to Marcella or to me. Didn't belong to Diane or to Avis or to Betty or to anybody. It really belongs to those who will move it along. And that's why from the very beginning, we were very intentional about the having something that was intergenerational, because we know that is the only way that movements grow and that people heal. Marcella always says that we can throw healing into the future, and we can also heal things in the past. We have that capacity, and intergenerationality is what gives us that ability to do that. So everyone, you are the legacy of BRJA. You are the one who'll take it into the future. And Anthony Newman, who will be stepping down from his position as staff in BRJA, he is the person who really birthed an institutional structure and frame, the operationalizing every single day that still was true to the values and the ethos and the heart of BRJA. I don't know that he could have done it without the membership, without his own practice, his own healing, his fidelity to that. And so when I think of the next 20 years, I think of Anthony straight up. I think of Dana. I think of Rebecca. I think of all of you who have been so instrumental in the journey. This is your journey. This is your legacy. And whether you are here as people who have a long history with BRJA, whether you are here as people who advocate for the work in the positions that you are in. I'm not going to call any names, but I hope y'all know who I'm talking about. No matter what brings you here, the fact is that you are part of BRJA's legacy because you too believe in seeding and feeding and harvesting justice. And that is the bottom line of BRJA, whether we're working with individuals, with community, or institutions.
Thank you, Adar. Dana, can we have the closing slides? So we must ask for the support that will continue to be needed if we want to continue having the staff and the organizational stamina to keep going into the future. So please consider what you are able to do to support BRJA financially. This is the QR code that you can find in the on the website, as well as in the Eventbrite, right? It's in there too, I believe. And we'll go to the next slide. For closing, we're using another image that Maricela provided with the birds, and we've added some text. I'm going to first read the bottom text from John Lewis, who we miss greatly. Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. And lastly, by Nikki Giovanni, if now isn't a good time for the truth, I don't see when we'll get to it. Thanks everybody for being here. We really appreciate every person who was part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending on this lovely Wednesday evening, and we hope to see you at our next events. And so you can look on our Eventbrite page, on our Facebook or our Instagram page for more information about what we have coming up this year. But thank you so much for coming tonight.
And thank you, moderators and tech person. We couldn't do it without you.